It's September 11, 2018. I'm in Richland, Washington, Cindy Kelly, and I have with me Michele Gerber. And what I'd like to ask her to do is to tell us her full name and spell it.
Michele Stenyem Gerber, Michele Stenehjem Gerber, Gerber.
Tell us a little more about your background. So, what did you study and how did you become interested in the history of Hanford?
Well, I studied American history as a PhD student, earned a PhD in 1975, and my major concentration was in the 20th century, populism, progressivism, the New Deal, the Cold War.
That's fantastic. And then how did you happen to fasten on Hanford's history?
Well, I moved to Richland, Washington, and so of course Hanford is the dominant industry. And the waste cleanup hadn't really started. In fact, it was not mandated in law until 1989, and I came here 2 years before that. But some of the preliminary studies were starting by the state of Washington. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control was also conducting a study of iodine emissions and health effects that later transitioned to the University of Washington. But at that time, it was being run directly by the Centers for Disease Control, and they hired me as a consultant to research some of the historical, statistical groups that they would have to gather. They would have to gather school groups and population groups from the 1940s. Well, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control was called in and decided that there was grounds to make a study, but they hadn't yet let a contract to a contractor. So they were doing their own preliminary studies. But they needed to know, could you establish who lived here? Did you have any way of doing that? Because during the Depression and into the 1940s in this area, it was so poor that most of the school districts didn't have secretaries in the schools. They didn't keep rolls of the schools. They didn't have any kind of really organized record keeping, these tiny hamlets east of the Tri-Cities of Washington. So it was a matter of going out into these tiny communities and trying to find out if a local historical society or a school by chance had some records that were defensible and could be put together from the 1940s.
Just a record of who was there.
Who was there. So in many cases, I would be walking up and down the halls of some rural school looking at graduation photos and literally counting people. And then sometimes I'd go to a rural school and I'd be given a box in some basement covered with spider webs to look for records from the 1940s.
Oh, that's fascinating. And then you had to compile a whole list, an inventory of everyone. And then what did you do?
Well, you had to find out whether you can do a population study. You've got to, if your statistical base is too small, then your results will not be defensible. And so you had to find out if that could even be done. And then they decided, yes, there was enough population. There were gaps, but there was enough record keeping that we could put together a cohort that could be studied.
So you said they were called in. Who were they called in by? Who started this?
The Hanford Site and the Department of Energy had proposed that Hanford would be one of the sites that would be a repository for national high-level waste storage. And the state of Washington did not want that, and the Yakama Indian tribe did not want that, and they were suing the Department of Energy over stopping this project. And in the midst of their discovery, they discovered a lot of historical records that caused them concern about health effects. And so they called in the Centers for Disease Control, asked them to take a look.
That's interesting. So what kind of health effects emerged in this?
Well, as part of the discovery in 1986, and this was before I got here, the Department of Energy released about 25,000 pages of historical documents. And they went right back all the way to the 1940s and the founding of the site. And those records proved to be surprising. And the state of Washington became concerned, and they requested more documents. And so some more documents came out in 1987, just before I arrived. And so there was this trove of historical documents that no one had really looked at in depth, certainly not a historian. And so they were taking a look. They were concerned enough that they brought in the Centers for Disease Control, and they said, you know, we'd like to take a look. We need to hire some local consultants, and I was one of those.
Did these documents talk about health effects? Were there?
Well, they didn't talk about health effects directly. They talked about emissions and waste releases. And so from there, you become concerned, okay, if these emissions have occurred, what effect have they had?
That's very interesting. So they already had the release information, like the, I suppose, the potential dose. I mean, I guess, at least, I guess there's a lot of detective work that had to happen then to figure out who was living where and how much one might have been individually exposed. Tell us about
It
that.
was a huge dose reconstruction that ended up happening. But in the beginning, it was much more of a broad sweep. It was what was out there. I mean, could you really find out what was out there? So I began to read some of these historical documents. That wasn't my assignment, but I began to read them. I wanted to know what I was dealing with. I wanted to learn more. And what happened was the documents raised more questions than they answered, because you couldn't tell. First of all, the measurement systems were very old. They're arcane. There are measurements that aren't even used today. And so you'll have a term such as REP, which stands for Röntgen Equivalent Physical. We don't use that term anymore. It's not quite equivalent to the term REM, but it's related. So how do you actually calculate back and forth, what's the dose? And the other thing that was unusual about these documents was that they were filled with code words. And so what I would do is immediately go to the footnotes of the document and say, how can I learn what this code word is? And so not being able to easily do that, I just request through the Freedom of Information Act all the documents in the footnotes.
Oh my! Did that? did the government supply those documents to you, or was this a fight?
Well, filing a Freedom of Information Act request, at least in those days, didn't cost much money. Today, I think it's by the page, or it's some different system, but you could request, but you got a lot of stalling, you got a lot of we can't find it, we're not sure. So I by then, was curious enough. I said, this is really grassroots history. This is what every historian dreams of, is to land somewhere and find a story that hasn't been told. And so I became more determined. And then I started requesting big documents that were, easily found. I mean, maybe you couldn't find a memo from 1944 that was half a page, but if you requested something that was several volumes, it was much harder for them to say they couldn't find it. So that was the new strategy, and I do remember what now is known as the Operational History of Hanford, written by DuPont in 1946. It's very detailed. It's 18 volumes, but it was still classified. And so I requested it and waited, I can't really remember, but several months, anywhere from 6 months to 10 months, I know I waited. And one day, literally, a delivery truck drove up in front of my house with the 18 volumes. And there it was. And of course, I sat up all night literally reading because you couldn't stop.
For heaven's sake. Oh my goodness. Now what, were these, did they give you a Xerox copy of all 18 volumes or?
Yes, it was all Xerox, and some of it was kind of hard to read, but it contained, if you really looked, if you really read it, absolutely startling information in that there was knowledge that releases were going out, radioactive releases, beyond the limits that had been set by the Manhattan Engineer District, and in some cases massively larger, and in some cases repeatedly larger, so that it became a pattern, not an anomaly. And at that point, then you really have an investigation going.
What kind of materials were in these releases?
Well, each volume is dedicated to a different aspect of operations. For instance, they were running the town of Richland, and so a couple of volumes are about city administration and the city housing and the city police. Another volume is about supplying electric power, and power to the Hanford site, all aspects. But you went to the key aspects: reactor operations, separations plant operations, and fuel-making operations, because those are the areas that are going to generate radioactive releases. And within those documents was contained some very startling information about the extent of releases and the concerns of the managers who knew about it and were writing these reports, that they themselves were sort of taken aback, amazed, not happy with these releases, and actually quite worried about them.
And that's expressed in the documents?
They're unemotional. They wouldn't use a word like amazed. They're almost just military precision. But they will say things like, such and such level was detected 30 miles from the reservation border, and these releases were beyond the measurable expected doses. So you didn't have to be very clever to realize that they were concerned, but they never said, "We are concerned."
Were you surprised that they were monitoring to the extent they were? When you mentioned 30 miles from the reservation, so what kind of monitoring were they doing?
Well, Hanford pioneered the whole science of environmental monitoring, and it's one of the greatest achievements of the site. It faltered in that it classified the results that it found for many, many years. But the science was very impressive, going out and monitoring the water, the fish, larvae, insects, bird life, coyotes, even cattle on local ranches, the grasses, the air itself. We're not getting into, at that point, underground, any kind of monitoring of underground releases. It's air and water at that point.
So did they talk about, was one of the things they developed monitoring devices themselves? There's a whole new art there where they...
Hanford did extend the science of monitoring to a huge degree. I mean, they had contracts with major suppliers of instrumentation and were having them develop instruments that had never been in use or seen in the world before. And so these were really, wonderful achievements. But what they were finding, there was the downside. They were finding huge releases of gases and waterborne radioactivity that were definitely unhealthy and known to be unhealthy.
So how did they deal with this? What were some of the things that DuPont did to protect or warn the populace?
One of the main responses that DuPont and the Department of the Army, which was running Hanford at the time, had to these releases was to do more measurements. Of course, you want to gather more data. You want to know if you're really seeing what you think you're seeing. You want to verify. You want to have many, many measurements so that it can't be seen as a spike or an anomaly or a problem at the plant. And so a lot more testing. The testing program went from, small to one of the biggest divisions and the entire site. It was rivaling the production departments in size and budget, personnel, so that they really expanded that monitoring to make sure they knew what they were really dealing with.
So they knew. How much did the workers or who was at risk there? I mean, I guess we're talking about the ecology, the fish, the plants, the birds, and so forth. Were there residents that were in harm's way?
Well, at the time in World War II, first of all, you didn't have any production. You didn't have any radioactive material released until the fall of 1944. So up to that point, no releases. Then you have production starting, and at that point, you have some of the highest releases in American history, going from about Christmas of 1944 till the end of the war, till about midsummer of 1945, a peak, because they're racing to develop the plutonium that's going to be needed for the weaponry. And the very first tiny amount of plutonium was sent to Los Alamos for development purposes in February 1945. So at that point, still pretty small. But then getting continual requests, secret requests from Los Alamos for more material. And so they're producing an awful lot during 1945. And even after the war ended, they had material in process. The production process is many, many weeks. And so they had material that they had started to produce. They had to finish the cycle. So the high releases go on throughout 1945.
So, but then if you look ahead, because you were doing this 30 years, 40 years later, and a lot happened between 1945 and the end of the war and 1986. So what happened, if you want to give a little synopsis, between 45, the end of the war, and 86 in terms of production at Hanford?
Well, the Cold War, of course, began. We usually date the beginning of the Cold War with President Truman's Truman Doctrine, which is March of 1947, where he essentially lays down the gauntlet that we are going to be dominant in this nuclear weaponry. 1949, the Soviets get the atomic bomb fully developed, and the race is on. So you really have the 50s and 60s as the peak of the arms race. And Hanford was the production workhorse for the United States. Hanford was Hercules. Hanford was Paul Bunyan. And so Hanford is producing a lot, and it's also emitting a lot. The emissions for gas, that is radioactive gases, primarily iodine-131, actually peaked about 1952. At that point, and they were scrambling to develop a technology to stop this. How do you stop it? Before that point, the only thing they had were physical filters, physical. So you could make the mesh of the filter tighter and tighter, but you still can't trap a gas. You can trap a particulate. But if you want to trap a gas, you have to cause a chemical reaction in the filter. And they did figure that out. And Oak Ridge actually developed a filter called a silver reactor, where the filter media was coated with silver iodide. A chemical reaction would take place as the gas passed through it and trap the gas. So then you have a technology that can stop those releases. The problem is that brand new, deployed on a large scale, right away at Hanford, it didn't work perfectly. And so you had a few years there between about 1952 and 55 where the filters aren't working quite right. For one thing, they would overheat, and at that point they wouldn't work. It'd literally burn out. And so the gas would come through and you'd have to develop a flow mechanism that would slow it down and also cool it down so that it would work very well. Up until they tried that with trial and error, they didn't have it quite right, and the filters wouldn't work perfectly. Meanwhile, production is rising, so the gas emissions are rising. And then they stabilize about 1955, 56, and they level off. And they have, from then on, just an occasional accident or spike where a filter will fail, but no continual releases.
So, in terms of your review, or maybe it was a CDC that took your data and went into the field, or how did they do the dose response study that they did?
Well, in 1990, the Centers for Disease Control let a contract to the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center in Seattle to actually conduct the study. At that point, I was out of the study. I was actually doing other research, and that went on into the medical and health physics professionals, and I'm not one of those.
But you got it started. You provided the baseline.
I hope I gave them a start to take a look at that part of American history.
That's very interesting, because I guess we need to, find others who can answer those questions as to how they did reconstruct the dose response. Hopefully, we can fill that gap in. But this has been a great insight, at least for me, about your work very early on, and that there was quite a bit of releases that DuPont became aware of, and then I guess its successor contractor was the one who tried to work with these filters, or maybe they did some filtration as well.
DuPont, they were not able to filter the gases. They relied on wind dispersion. They thought they were being very modern, and they hired a meteorologist even before operations began to predict the wind patterns. And they developed models that we might see as a little bit simplistic, but they were doing their best. They had coning model and fanning model, and it was all dependent on how the wind was going to disperse in certain conditions. And it wasn't just wind velocity, because the Hanford site has many microclimes and little rising up hills in it and little depressions, and it has the river. And so there's a great deal of mixing of the air. And so they developed what they thought was a good formula for how fast the wind could blow, the direction, and these little patterns that would result from the microclimate effects. And so they would say, well, in certain conditions, go ahead and dissolve the irradiated metal, which would generate the gas. Other conditions, yeah, you can dissolve, but don't dissolve a lot or be cautious. And then other conditions, don't dissolve. These conditions are considered dangerous. During 1945, they dissolved in all conditions because they were hurrying to produce, and they simply dissolved whenever they needed to dissolve, despite the wind conditions.
Can you just take a second and explain what you mean by dissolve?
In the plutonium production process, you place uranium inside a reactor and irradiate it. When it comes out of that reactor, it's still a solid piece of metal. You have to dissolve it in acid in order to extract the plutonium fraction. When you dissolve is when you evolve gases.
So the gases you're talking about would have come from the 200 area where they did this chemical separation process?
Absolutely. The gas was evolved from the separations facilities in the 200 areas. We are not talking about releases from reactors. The reactors did release some noxious gases, but nothing compared to the separations plants. There was an event called the Green Run, December 1st and 2nd, 1949. And at that was a test. Recall that the Soviet Union had just exploded its first atomic bomb at the last day of August. And it was detected at Hanford first in the world outside of the Soviet Union. And it was detected by Hanford's air filters that had been set up to monitor Hanford's own iodine gases. And pretty soon, it was Labor Day weekend, and pretty soon all the air monitors started alarming, high releases. And people who were home on vacation were called in, running to the plant to see where is the accident, what has failed. Would you have some big, gas leak? And there were no problems at the plant. And so they consulted with the Department of Defense, and they deduced that this was gas coming down the jet stream from Siberia. And this was part of the Soviet Union's program. That's how we knew, as a nation, that the Soviets had the bomb. So here you are, second week of September, and the Department of Defense said, we want to come out and run a test of these air filters and just see what is the threshold, how do we gauge how much is coming out, how fresh, how soon it has dispersed. And so they set up a test with Hanford's air monitors. The problem was that the late fall in the Columbia Basin is always full of fog and inversions. It's very characteristic here. And that didn't mesh well with the plans of the Department of Defense to run a test here at that time. By the time they got organized, it was November, and the fog is rolling in. And the Department of Defense officials were here for 2 or 3 weeks waiting for a clear day. They didn't get a clear day. And they finally got what they thought was going to be an okay day to run a test where they would release quite a bit of iodine gas and then monitor the filters. And they had filters set up all the way to Spokane, all over the area. And they were going to gain their data. They did release the gas, and an inversion moved in, and it actually rained. So it wasn't just wet fog, it was actually raindrops. And the gas came down close in and heavy. And so that was the Green Run, where exposures were very heavy around Walla Walla, Franklin County, just east of the Hanford site and just north.
I hadn't realized it was linked to the efforts to figure out what the Soviet test consisted of. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Oh, I thought it was just a production run, and they took green fuel that hadn't marinated long enough, or cooled off is a better word, and the cooling water.
So they did take, for the Green Run, they took very fresh fuel, only been out of the reactor a few days, whereas normally you want to cool it a long time.
So they did that, there was a deliberate.
Yes.
That's very interesting. Because I know they delayed the announcement of detecting the Soviet test, and this was what was going on. They were trying to confirm how big it was, or do these runs, I'm not sure.
I don't know all those details. Definitely Hanford was called into service to help them measure how much, gas is evolved when you do this. And of course, a bomb test, the fission products are fresh. They're not cooled at all. And so they wanted to be able to compare and calculate. If you have fresh fission products and they're released in Kazakhstan or Siberia, and it takes so many days to travel, what does that look like? in terms of what kind of isotopes are we going to detect in what strength. And so remember, iodine-131 has a half-life of 8 days. So it's really easy to calculate. If you're seeing this much, it must be 2 weeks ago, or it must be this strength. And so that's how Hanford was being helpful in this process.
It's fascinating. Ah, that's great. So that was 1949, the fall of 49. Interesting. So these doses that were picked up as far as Yakima and Spokane were 10 times the usual amount that might have been released, or do you have any order of magnitude of how much this dropped on the civilian? But it's looked at as a significant marker of exposure. I don't know. Is it
The green run, I can't tell you, orders of magnitude, how many times what would be normal, because what would even be normal. But we know that it was one of the largest single point source releases in American history.
And I guess that was compounded in its adversity to those surrounding communities because of the weather, because the rain precipitated it in a way that they did not anticipate. Is that correct?
It's correct that they did not anticipate it raining out and coming down in certain spots, which they called hot spots, that were very, very heavily impacted. They didn't expect that. And that included the Tri-Cities. Did not include Yakima because that is to the west, and the winds always blow to the east here.
So in terms of the downwinder, so-called downwinder population, where were the hot spots, or where was the greatest exposures? Would it be the eastern populace or in the area, or how do you characterize that?
The greatest exposures were almost an ellipse, and there are maps. There was sort of an elliptical shape, and it curved just a little bit north and east of the site and went up to the town of Connell, thereabouts, almost to the town of Ritzville. And then it sort of bulged out to the east, covering Franklin County and Walla Walla counties.
And that is where you found, or the CDC found, the most affected populations, is that correct?
The downwinder population in general is on the east side of the Hanford site, either directly east Franklin County, southeast Walla Walla County, or right in the Tri-Cities.
Do you have any sense of proportion that in these communities, what percent of population were affected? Like, is that hard to generalize?
As a historian, I can't say anything about portions or percentages. I know that the Centers for Disease Control study that was run by Fred Hutchinson did not find a significant effect, statistically significant effect. So that's hard data. Anecdotal data all over this area is very different. And so it's really, in my view, an unsettled matter in terms of American history.
So when you say it's a statistically significant effect, can you explain that? What does that mean?
I'm not a statistician, but statistically significant, you have to have a spike that is in some way, statistically provable that it's above what would be normal or average in a population. And that did not occur, as far as I know, in the Fred Hutchinson study. But all over this area, you won't convince very many people that there was no effect. Well, one thing is we haven't talked much about the riverborne. Do you want to talk about that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Hanford's problem with the Columbia River began very soon after World War II. In World War II, yes, the reactor effluent or cooling water that had been through the reactors was channeled to the Columbia River. But we don't find very much effect. There's not zero effect, but not much effect. It's after the Cold War begins, and they're building more reactors, and they're also raising the power levels of the reactors that they already have built. And that essentially means pushing more cooling water through. The way that you will increase the power level is to increase the heat. That is, you will put either more uranium or partly enriched uranium, generate more heat, you'll need more cooling water. When you want to raise the power level of, these are old-fashioned reactors, very simple machines, the way that you push the power level higher is to put in either more uranium or closely spaced, fewer so-called spacers or duds, or you will put in partly enriched uranium. That causes the fission reaction to go faster, hotter, and you need more cooling water to cool it down. So essentially raising the power level of these old-fashioned reactors necessitates pushing more water through them. So you're going to have more water in, more water out to the Columbia River, and additionally more reactors. And so in the late 1940s is when the river effects become quite noticeable. And they're noticeable because the staff of the biology operation at Hanford is growing. They're doing their due diligence, they're measuring the water, the fish, the mud, all the parts of the river. And by the summer of 1947, which isn't very long into the process, they're already saying, gee, the levels are double what they were last year in certain parts of the river or certain patches of mud. And by 1949, you know, wow, now they're 3 or 4 times what they were. And by the mid-1950s and the late 1950s, you're getting exponential. I mean, exponential in that a sample of a fish might be 50 times what it was. It might be 100,000 times what it was in World War II. And so the problems in the river are getting severe. There's also chemical contamination. Reactors, you know, there's chemicals added to the water, but the main problem comes because the water, the process tubes that hold the water will develop a film over time. And you have to purge off that film, you have to scrape it and rinse it off, or it will interfere with the fission reaction. And so you would have to add purge chemicals and sometimes particulates to the cleaning water, the cooling water, run it through the reactor to purge the film off the tubes, and out would come an array of chemicals into the river. And as the reactors operated hotter and with more water, the film developed faster, and you are at the point by the mid-1950s that you're having to purge a reactor every month. In some cases, in the early 1960s, more than once a month per reactor. And so you're having a huge chemical burden introduced to the river. And in some cases, the site scientists would say in their secret reports, the chemical burden is almost worse than the radiological burden. So you have that. Of course, it's all classified. The public is not being told. The third problem is heat. Of course, the reactor water enters from the river at about, I'm going to say a year-round average of 50 to 70 degrees. And it's going to come out at near boiling. It's going to come out at up to almost the boiling point. In fact, over the years, the Atomic Energy Commission raised the exit water temperature limits over and over, to the point that by 1962, the operating limit was, as long as the water didn't flash to steam, it could come out at 1 to 1/2 degree below boiling. So it's coming out very hot. And by this time also you've got more water, less capacity to retain it, to cool it off before it goes back. It's going into the river, sometimes only 30 minutes after it came out of the reactor. So it hasn't cooled very much. By the early 1960s, the heat load was such that the reactors, they were afraid were going to have to shut down in the summer. They couldn't even operate because of the heat load in the water. So they developed a secret plan with the Department of the Interior that runs Grand Coulee Dam to release large quantities in mass from Lake Roosevelt, which is the upstream side of the Grand Coulee Dam, and flush cold water down through the Hanford Reach so that the reactors could continue to run all summer long. They did that from 1960, it was either 61 or 62, not sure which, for about 4 years. And then the reactors began to shut down and the problems was fixing itself.
So do you want to talk about why some of these reactors were shut down? And was that, what, 1964?
In 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. In 1964, in January, in the State of the Union message, President Johnson announced that Hanford reactors would begin to close in a phased manner. And they started to close in December 1964. And then that progressed over years to the point that all the old reactors were closed by 1971. And Reactor closed for a couple of months, reopened, and continued. But the reasons are under debate among historians, okay? Certainly our nation was not slowing down its plutonium production. That's not the answer, because we were ramping up production at Savannah River, and we were certainly producing more weaponry after 1964 than before, and that went on for several years. So why Hanford? And there are several theories, and one theory is that, and this is a silly one, okay, that President Johnson didn't like Hanford because they did experiments on beagle dogs and he loved beagle dogs. So that's certainly not a serious historical theory, but some people will tell you that. Among the theories are really that in secret, the secret documents were showing that the Columbia River could not bear the burden anymore. And that a very, very powerful senator who is Scoop Jackson, Henry Jackson from the state of Washington, was aware of that through the secret documents that he was privy to, and that he had to bow to that pressure, that we can't do this anymore. And so that the government made a decision to move the production elsewhere, but to still keep national production high. And there's quite a bit of good evidence for that. But being a good politician, Henry Jackson and our other senator, who was Warren Magnuson, also very powerful, were not going to let their region lose this giant industry without getting something back. So they went to Washington and said, we need something, a give back. We need something in the burgeoning realm of peaceful nuclear power. And that's how the Hanford site was chosen for the fast flux test reactor.
So what was the fast flux test reactor?
The fast flux test reactor, or known as FFTF, was going to be the prototype for a civilian power reactor. It was going to produce electric power, not weaponry. However, its fuel was going to be partly plutonium, which is not the case in normal, everyday power reactors today in the United States. This was going to be the prototype for a new type. And that got to be a very scary aspect and caused a lot of controversy in the history of that reactor and eventually caused its shutdown.
Did it ever actually run? Or what's
Yeah, I was going to say yeah. The FFTF ran for a few years. It was actually had its first hot test run in 1980, was officially commissioned, but didn't run at full power till 1983. And then it did run for just a few years. But already there were, problems. The US government and the whole national policy under President Carter was turning away from plutonium-based fuels, and so that program was dying on a national level. And the reactor ran mostly with experimental tests from abroad, from the Japanese and others, who put their experiments in there with plutonium-based fuels. And our country turned away from all of that. And so the reactor really didn't have a mission or a future.
Okay. One thing you haven't talked about is the backyard cow and all of that, all the monitoring. It seemed like they were going through this elaborate process to keep the civilian population in the dark about the potential threats or health effects from their operations, and yet feeling they had to do something. So can you talk about that, the signs, drink carnation?
Well, a farmland problem came in two ways. It came from gaseous deposits on the grass and on the animals themselves, and they would eat the grass contaminated with radioisotopes, and it would transfer into their milk. And the other problem came from irrigated crops, irrigated with water from the Columbia River just below Hanford. And so there was a concern among the scientists at Hanford, that somehow they would have to protect the people or give them subtle warnings, but without panicking the population. You can't panic the population. They might all move away. You might not have a workforce. And so you had to give what, in their view, was some protection. And of course, in the 21st century, we would argue against that kind of decision-making in secret, but that was what they were doing. And so sometimes they would tell people, don't drink the milk from your backyard cow, buy it commercially. They would bring it in from a little bit west of the Hanford area, either western Benton County or even in Yakima County. And they would tell people to use that milk source. Also, there were a lot of subtle warnings, such as cutting down certain sage plants in your yard because of allergies. In fact, they happen to, the so-called leaves or bracts of those plants happen to be good collection devices for the radioactive gases. They had a number of things that could be interpreted as very subtle warnings. That has never been absolutely proved, but certainly circumstantially, there's a lot of reason to believe that.
So those actions, did they happen after DuPont's presence? They're not in the 18 volumes. I'm just wondering where they started to do those kinds of things.
Those warnings can be found in the Richland Villager newspaper, which was published during World War II, and it was a company newspaper published by DuPont for the Richland Village. They called it Village at the time.
Did it continue under GE, or was it?
The newspaper itself went out of business, so you find the Richland Villager, I think, last published, I believe, in 1949. And so there was some years of publishing when General Electric was running the site. And yes, the warnings are still there in 1947, 48, and 49. Interestingly, they would publish maps of where you could hunt and where you should hunt. And again, those can be interpreted as unnatural boundaries, shall we say, boundaries that might have been drawn for a reason other than normal hunting boundaries. And so a lot of warnings that were subtle going through the period of the late 1940s.
And then there were no more warnings, or there wasn't this organ that, or the newspaper, that the plant managers had a hand in. I don't know.
You know, after starting in 1950, you can trace a newspaper here called the Columbia Basin News. It was not published by the managers of Hanford. It was independent. It was based in Pasco, I believe. And it did not give those kinds of subtle warnings. They are not to be found. However, you still had public health bulletins from the medical department of the General Electric Company here, and those have continued all the way until Richland became an independent city in 1958.
Fascinating. So when do you suppose the population became aware of this ruse, I guess you might call it, or these subtle hints?
You know, I don't think that this information was not available until the document releases of the 1980s. And so you did not have that. You would have things coming out from the environmental contractors at Hanford during the 60s and 70s regarding fishing and where you ought to fish and ought not to fish. And of course, behind the scenes, there's a huge debate going on about whether or not you needed to close certain areas to fishing or warn fishermen specifically. A lot of times, diet studies were undertaken where fishermen were interviewed. How much do you eat? How much does your family eat of this fish? And what times of the year do you fish here? Because, of course, in the river, the pollution was worst in the late summer and fall when the river flow is very low and the levels of contamination would rise. And so there was a lot of interviewing and a lot of talking, but you never have a clear-cut, flat-out warning that you should not do these things because there is contamination. And that wasn't known until 1986.
What happened then?
Well, the documents began to be released, and the state of Washington Health Department was involved, and they began to, let the public know that this had been a problem. And by then, it really wasn't a problem.
Oh, it's a good time to let people know. Interesting. So were most of the health effects that were observed, can you characterize the whole range? Was it thyroid cancer plus this plus that? Was it a whole variety of manifestations?
Well, you can say that certain isotopes are known to cause certain cancers. And of course, iodine-131 heads straight for the thyroid. And that's going to be the most affected organ. That's not the only gas, but that was the major gas of concern. In the river isotopes, you have isotopes that are going to affect the gastrointestinal tract. And so there has not been a study of whether there was more intestinal cancer or esophageal cancer or colon cancer. There has not been a study. But those are the areas that those isotopes would naturally attack. In the mid-1950s, Hanford scientists, geologists began to discover a trend that was brand new, that underneath some of the groundwater disposal sites, where groundwater would simply be flooded with lower level effluents from the Hanford plants, they discovered that the groundwater was actually mounding up. And so mounds were developing below the surface in the water table. And these were causing water to then run underground in different patterns than had been natural. And so you would find, or they were finding by about the late 1950s, that if you disposed some effluent with not the hot levels of reactor effluent, but lower level cleansing waters from the various plants, and you dispose those in the ground, they wouldn't run in the pattern that you might expect. They might run in a completely different pattern. In fact, they might run what you would think of as upstream or up gradient. They would run around a little mound and go somewhere else. And so the groundwater was becoming contaminated and pooling in different ways. And that became a huge area of study for Hanford geologists, of course, again, in secret. But then they had to decide with the plant managers, well, how are we going to divert this, and where are we going to put all this effluent? And it became quite a concern. At the same time, it was discovered, suspected in 1954 and confirmed in 1956 that tanks were leaking. But the underground waste tanks were also leaking into the soil, in some cases penetrating to groundwater, although unconfirmed for a long, long time. Again, that was considered a downstream problem that wasn't going to directly affect the population. They felt they would have many years to devise solutions, and so no warnings were given about that.
And this is because these tanks are 10 miles from the river. Is that what they were thinking? Or?
Yes, the Hanford waste tanks are all in the 200 areas, the center of the site. They're not near the river. Reactors do not have waste tanks next to them. And so they felt, the managers felt, you know, we have time, we will devise a solution. And that became the never-ending story that we are still dealing with today. I guess I'll wrap up by saying the Hanford site offers many lessons for the 21st century. And among those are, one lesson is the lesson of unintended consequences. The very good and very smart people, very well-intentioned, motivated to protect the country or protect something, can also do a lot of harm. Another lesson is that when you have a new technology, it's not a good idea to just leave experts in charge of it. If you think of the new technologies of the 21st century, such as genetic technologies or information technologies, some people might say, well, it's so complicated, the average person can't understand how those things work, so we'll just leave the decisions to the scientists. And that's a very bad idea, in my opinion, because at Hanford, the new technology was nuclear reactors. And many people thought, well, the public can't understand it, so we'll just leave the decisions to the experts. And they made some very disastrous decisions. And that shouldn't happen in a democracy. That's my opinion.